Hello, and welcome to another production of The Spring House at Dalesford Abbey. My name is Dr. Andrew Del Rossi, and I am the director of the Spirituality Center here at the Abbey. Today, as we reflect on the Feast of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, we will look at this devotion through the visionary eyes of mystic, priest, and paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. Teilhard envisions evolution as the process by which creation is growing in its relationship with God. And at the culmination of this process, the divine will be fully manifest through creation. Now, Teilhard lived during a time of much social upheaval, much global change, much like the time in which we are living now. Therefore, we will take a look at Teilhard's devotion to the Sacred Heart and look at how that might inspire us in our own faith lives to grow closer in God in this day and age. We will do today's talk over the course of 3 parts. The first part will take a look at some general biographical information on Teilhard, who he was as a person, as well as looking at the general outline of his thought. Second, we will look at Teilhard's unique devotion to the Sacred Heart of Jesus and how this inspired him to work through the struggles and difficulties that he found himself immersed within. Third, we will take a look at why Teilhard's devotion to the Sacred Heart is particularly relevant today in our own time of social upheaval and change, and we will look at how his larger vision can inspire us to have an equally radically optimistic and hopeful vision of the future. So let us begin with a brief biographical sketch of Teilhard and a general outline of his thought. Teilhard was born in France in 1881 to a devout Catholic mother and a father who was an amateur naturalist. Therefore, it was quite organic for him to seek God in both of these experiences, as he would eventually be a professed member, a priest within the Society of Jesus, as well as go on to pursue and complete his doctoral degree in paleontology. Teilhard, in his early life as a professional, was a profound educator. He taught physics and chemistry at the Jesuit College of the Holy Family in Cairo in Egypt, as well as lecturing at the Catholic Institute in Paris. He also headed the geology lab at the Museum of Natural History in Paris, along with serving as a stretcher bearer in World War I. Now, when you think of a mystic, you think of someone who has a deep ability to perceive an intimacy with God, with the divine within one's life. And when you think of Teilhard and the true Renaissance person that he was, and the many angles which he saw life from, and the acute detail that he was searching for in all these experiences, you almost wonder, how could this guy not be a mystic? He was looking at reality from so many different angles, as a priest, as a scientist, as a soldier, as a friend, as a writer, as a traveler. How could one not have a multi-dimensional perspective, vision of the divine in creation? But anyway, we can see that the circumstances of Teilhard's life would eventually direct him and its trajectory to a sort of exile in China, where he was confined to doing his paleontological research, looking at the earth for bones, for rocks, for anything that evidenced previous civilizations and what we can learn from them. But he was forbidden from writing spiritually. Because his ideas were so ahead of their time during the period in which they were written, there were many who got excited about his work, yet there were also many who were very skeptical and hesitant about it. So that's another presentation for another day. But what we can learn from this experience was that in Teilhard taking that struggle head on and him engaging in that experience in China of a sort of isolation and a sort of retreat in the desert, he was able to, in a sense, have himself be open so as to experience the divine in a greater clarity. Now, when we think of Teilhard's work, we have to think of his work as happening in spheres. This comes to his Christology, this comes to his cosmology, but really the two are kind of one and the same, and we'll see what I mean by that when we take a look at a diagram here. So when we say that Teilhard's theory of evolution and his scientific outlook on the world, along with his Christological vision, when we say that they work in spheres, we can look to our own planet Earth here as an example. We see that Earth begins as its liquid, molten core. This core, over time, cools, it solidifies enough as to create a crust around that liquid center. And then eventually, with the advent of the hydrosphere, or the layer of water that encircles the Earth, we see that the conditions become ripe for life to burst forth in the biosphere. All the flora and fauna that we experience now are but a fraction of what has existed in prehistoric times up until now. And this layer of evolution was not the final layer, saw Teilhard, but only a threshold onto the next layer, which he calls the noosphere. Teilhard was instrumental in co-developing this idea of the noosphere, or the layer of mind which encircles the Earth. We can see here the progression from the cellular level all the way up to this level of mind in which the human person is able to communicate in a way that was seen early on in what we could identify as social networks, right? We see beehives, we see ant colonies, which manifest these characteristics that we see now so real and apparent, and the household items in the human world today when we talk about social media and global connection, things like that. That's all part of the noosphere, or this cognitive layer that surrounds the Earth. Now, Teilhard says that noosphere is not even the final layer of creation, is not the final layer of evolution, because we can see, maybe only in glimpses at times, but there is another layer beyond mind. We could say that this is a layer of God, a layer of divinity, and that when the noosphere matures and evolves enough, humanity, through our consciousness, the fact that we are self-conscious makes us a phenomenon, says Teilhard. We know that we know. Humanity has the ability to see that there is another emerging layer beyond the noosphere, which Teilhard calls the diosphere, or the theosphere, even termed the Christosphere. This is the layer of evolution in which God is fully manifest within the consciousness of the planet, within the consciousness of humanity inhabiting that planet. Now, this theosphere concept is perhaps more commonly known within the thought of Teilhard de Chardin as the omega point. The omega point is the end point in creation, says Teilhard. It's the maximum point of complexity and consciousness. From the earliest stages of cosmic evolution, we can see how the increase in complexity, from the combining of simple molecules and atoms forming more complex structures over the course of time, has resulted in also the rise of consciousness. The more that those smaller parts have come together to form larger wholes, the more those larger wholes have become conscious, so that we have a human person made up of trillions of bacteria, trillions of viruses and fungi within ourselves, on top of our skin, that eventually concress in a way so as to form an organism, which, like I said, in which Teilhard was so enamored by, is self-aware. Now, this great self-awareness, says Teilhard, leads us to believe in what is known as, or what he calls, the cosmic Christ. The cosmic Christ encapsulates Christ's nature as not just the typical hypostatic nature of being both human and divine, but being human, divine, and cosmic. Everything, every star, every atom within the cosmos is bound together in Christ. And for Teilhard, he calls this the cosmic Christ. This is the teleological attractor at the end of time, which is pulling history, pulling evolution in toward a kind of ultimate point of meaning and relationship. Now, this thought may seem overly optimistic. This may seem incredibly radical, as it certainly does in a time in which we see much tension within our world. However, you have to understand that it is because of Teilhard's experience with death and with struggle, and of course his belief in the Paschal mystery, that he was able to have such a radically optimistic and hopeful vision of the future. So as we move away from Teilhard's biographical sketch and an outline of his thought, we step toward his devotion to the Sacred Heart. Teilhard's devotion to the Sacred Heart was to a different image than was traditionally held by many Jesuits during the time. The Jesuits had commissioned what is known as the Batoni image, so this would have been common for members of the society to carry with them and hold a devotion to. However, in 1921, a French artist by the name of Henri Pinta, who was known for religious paintings along with mosaics and stained glass, developed an image, a rendition of the Sacred Heart that was much different. Instead of the Batoni image, which kind of focused on the humanness of the heart, its bloody characteristics, the Pinta image focuses more on the light which emerges from Christ's center out of his heart. Using the technique of chiaroscuro, Pinta shows how a certain contrast can create this light effect where it shows an emanating, radiating light out of Christ's center that for Teilhard much more accurately captured what he understood to be Christ as not so much using the antiquated language of sin and sentimentality, that sort of mediator which brings us to wholeness, but instead a cosmic fire which burns within each human person, burns within the collective of humanity, and burns within the entire cosmos that brings all of the universe into being and into fulfillment in God. Now, this vision for Teilhard is definitely part of what inspired his radical and optimistic vision for the future. However, it's important to note that this vision of the Sacred Heart for Teilhard and the devotion that he held himself to with this was something that took many, many years to crystallize and develop for him. It was in 1916 that Teilhard first documented his experience with the Sacred Heart. This was at a time in his life when he was very depressed, very distraught. He was caught in the throes of the trenches of the First World War as a stretcher bearer, witnessing hell on earth around him. He finds a moment of solace and solitude. He finds himself praying in a chapel and then experiences a profound mystic vision in which he finds Christ's presence radiating throughout all of creation.
All I know is that as I let my eyes roam over the outlines of the picture, I suddenly realized that they were melting. They were melting, but in a very special way that I find it difficult to describe. When I tried to distinguish the drawing of the person of Christ, the lines seemed to be sharply defined. And then, if I relaxed my visual concentration, the whole of Christ's outline, the folds of his robe, the bloom of his skin, merged, though without disappearing, into all the rest. You might have said that the edge which divided Christ from the surrounding world was changing into a layer of vibration in which all distinct delimitation was lost. First, I noticed that the vibrant atmosphere which formed a halo around Christ was not confined to a narrow strip encircling him, but radiated into infinity. From time to time, what seemed to be trails of phosphorescence streamed across it, in which could be seen a continuous pulsing surge which reached out to the furthest spheres of matter, forming a sort of crimson ganglion or nervous network running across every substance. The whole universe was vibrating, and yet when I tried to look at the details one by one, I found them still all sharply drawn, their individual character still intact. All this movement seemed to emanate from Christ, from his heart in particular. And it was while I was trying to find my way back to the source of this effluence and determine its rhythm that my attention returned to the portrait itself, and then I saw the vision rapidly mount to its climax. At nighttime, you have often seen some stars that change the quality of their light. At one moment they are blood-red beads, and then they take on the shimmer of purple velvet. Similarly, you have seen the colors of the rainbow float in a transparent bubble. It was thus that the light and the colors of all the beauties we know shone, with an inexpressible iridescence over the face of Jesus, itself unmoved. I cannot say whether it was an expression of my own wishes, or whether it was the choice of him who determined and knew my tastes. But one thing I know, that these countless modifications, instinct with majesty, sweetness, and irresistible appeal, followed one another in succession, were transformed, melted into one another in a harmony that was utterly satisfying to me. This scintillation of beauties was so total, so all-embracing, and at the same time so swift that it reached down into the very powerhouse of my being, flooding through it in one surge, so that my whole self vibrated to the very core of me with a full note of explosive bliss that was completely and utterly unique.
However, it was not until 1939 that Teilhard would come to describe the heart of the risen Christ as the omega point. So this shows us that Teilhard's journey with this devotion took many forms over many years and had to change in order to meet what he found to be most personal within his spiritual life that allowed him to feel this personal connection with the risen Christ, with Christ Omega, who was bringing all of creation into wholeness through his very being. For Teilhard, this image of the Sacred Heart, Pinta's in particular, helped him to reconcile the two different directions that he felt his life being pulled in. As a scientist and as a priest, he felt like he was heading in two contradictory ways, so much though that he was seeking we could say it, the upward movement of the infinite in his spiritual pursuits, as well as the forward progression of evolution. So if you picture this as a graph of sorts where you have the upward movement and then the forward movement, Teilhard couldn't find himself siding with one or the other, but instead created a third way on a diagonal, as to use our graph model, where this way was to encounter the infinite, the all, the absolute, by going through evolution. And Christ, for Teilhard, was at the center of this. The cosmic Christ was who was holding this entire process of evolution, of catastrophe, of growth, of diminishment, of triumph, coming together, becoming more whole, and growing more conscious as to be able to express this living reality of God present within us.
Teilhard writes, "Under the symbol of the Sacred Heart, the divine assumed for me the form, the strength, and the properties of an energy, of a fire. Through its power to become universal, this fire proved able to invade and impregnate with love the whole atmosphere of the world in which I lived."
Teilhard's devotion to the Sacred Heart, his devotion through this image by Henry Pinta in particular, this image which really focuses on that contrast of the light and darkness, was what enabled him to see two things going forward. The first was that he believed that this image, or what this image signified, the deeper meaning of Christ being that central fire of evolution, he saw this as the next stage in the devotion itself. Second, he also saw this as the next stage, this light emanating forth of Christ consciousness from the human person, sanctifying, divinizing the world, as the next stage in the evolution of Christianity. And that's where we are called to participate within the great work as co-creators within evolution. And now we will move toward the third and final part of our presentation, the significance of the devotion of the Sacred Heart and Teilhard's thought today. Again, Teilhard lived during a time where there was a growing and global awareness of mass social upheaval. It was the First World War. And Teilhard was particularly exposed to the horrors of the situation by being within the trenches himself. Yes, yet within that experience, he was deeply inspired. He saw the swarms of humanity moving, the different formations of troops on the battlefield, as to resemble different patterns which he saw already present within nature. He saw that, like the many bees which come together to form a hive which interacts synergistically and symbiotically with its environment, the human person was also capable of channeling its focus toward a higher goal. And because Teilhard had the upbringing he did, because he had the experiences he had, he was prone to see this whole as the cosmic Christ, which was drawing all of creation to himself. Now, this was hard for Teilhard to express during his lifetime. He definitely faced a lot of backlash from within his own society, as well as from Rome. However, he also found an audience of people open-minded like himself, with their gaze focused on the future and how they could participate in, that really embraced his vision and were the purveyors of this vision into the future, as there were restrictions on Teilhard publishing his works during the time of his life. Therefore, as we go forward personally now as a people to engage within the world, we take with us the vision that Teilhard leaves us, that in experiencing the Paschal mystery, there is great hope, there is room, and there is necessity for that radical optimism that he sees taking place. Now, I'd like to present this in a way so as to play a little off of what we see in the world as a general social commentary, in so much as that we are left with a choice. We are left with a choice, says Teilhard, as to choose the pole that we wish to turn our gaze to. Teilhard sees within the noosphere as a potential bifurcation happening, or a splitting. There are two poles of consciousness which Teilhard says that we might, as human people, gravitate toward, and the one is that of denial, despair, fear, and isolation. This is something that is all too real for us now as we flick on the news, as we swipe open our social media, and we are just bombarded with a barrage of different videos and images and texts that immediately trigger chemical responses within us, whether they be releases of dopamine that make us feel good about what was just said or happened, or just a total flooding of stress hormones that get us all stressed and tensed up and angry and self-righteous. And I think this kind of encapsulates what Teilhard talks about in terms of seeing the whole picture. That is the Christ that Teilhard drew from the scriptures, from Colossians in particular, where Paul talks about all being held together, all being held together, all opinions, all peoples, all different ends of the spectrum, from how we should live our lives to how we should not live our lives. All are held together in Christ. And this was the perspective that Teilhard continually was reminded of through this devotion to the Sacred Heart and through his own participation within the struggles of his life and within the larger struggles of the world around him. So much so that in this splitting of the noosphere, we see how we can turn our gaze toward hope and optimism, or we can easily turn it toward that of despair and isolation and desolation and death and depression. And while that is a part of the picture, it is very important to acknowledge within this that as the larger collective of humanity, much like the bees that swarm together to create a functional and healthy hive, and much like those forces which Teilhard saw swarming together in formation on the battlefield, the entire collective of humanity, says Teilhard, has the ability to rise to consciousness, rise to embody that great reality of Christ living within us. Teilhard says within his seminal work, The Phenomenon of Man, to be able to say literally to God that one loves him, not only with all one's body, all one's heart, and all one's soul, but with every fiber of the unifying universe. That is a prayer that can only be made in space-time. And so we have, through that very person of Jesus of Nazareth, that manifestation of that prayer within space-time. Teilhard goes back to the scripture and says,
as early as in St. Paul and St. John, we read that to create, to fulfill, and to purify the world is, for God, to unify it by uniting it organically with himself. How does he unify it? By partially immersing himself in things, by becoming element, and then, from this point of vantage in the heart of matter, assuming the control and leadership of what we now call evolution.
Organically with himself, Jesus comes into history and then gives us this message of redemption and really of transformation and of ascension to a higher level of consciousness and a higher way of being present within this world.
Teilhard writes, Christian love is incomprehensible to those who have not experienced it. That the infinite and the intangible can be lovable, or that the human heart can beat with genuine charity for a fellow being, seems impossible to many people I know.
And that's because unless we have been consciously able to engage and enter into our own personal struggles and sufferings, the Paschal mystery becomes very difficult to know. It becomes very difficult to encounter. And if one is unable to do that within their own personal life, it becomes incredibly difficult for one to have a larger perspective about the whole of humanity and how all of these efforts which we are going through globally are moving and shaping our existence and our reality on this planet as to reflect what is intrinsic within us. And for Teilhard, that is the cosmic Christ. That is that heart that beats at the center of the universe. It is that burning fire that brought us into being and continues to bring us to fullness and wholeness in God. Teilhard says,
the human group is in fact turning, by planetary arrangement and convergence of all elemental terrestrial reflections, towards a second critical pole of reflection of a collective and higher order.
And with that first pole of reflection being in upon ourselves, the second pole is within the collective we, within the collective body of humanity, and the collective body of Christ that is expressed through humanity, embracing its humanness, embracing its struggle, embracing the reality of death so as to be transformed by that reality into a more luminous being of transformation upon the earth. While Teilhard was in the trenches, he was also often referred to by his fellow soldiers as the smiling scientist. Although he had a deep internal battle with doubt, despair, and particularly depression, especially when he was within the trenches of the war, he was always seen by his peers as being incredibly optimistic. And this was because it's credited, and I can't tell you exactly where, but that when Teilhard was presented with this idea of dying, he just kind of said, when I die, I'll go to a different frequency. And that's something that might take us into the realm of quantum physics to be able to explore entirely. However, we can see here that we certainly change frequencies when we come to that larger realization that our struggles and our sufferings within our own personal lives and within the collective of humanity are molding and shaping us in terms of being able to be transformed into something that is more indicative and more expressive of that heart of Christ within the heart of matter. So as we go forward today, we take Teilhard's vision with us, and it's an important adage to remember, which comes from Teilhard, often attributed to him, yet sometimes hard to find a citation on. His affirmation that we are not human beings having a spiritual experience. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. And insomuch as Teilhard sees the word cosmos being problematic because it implies a static state to the universe, he says cosmogenesis is in fact the more appropriate term. It describes the fact that we are in an act of becoming. That cosmogenesis becomes a spiritual evolution, and that spiritual evolution, says Teilhard, becomes a Christogenesis. So today, as we reflect and we celebrate the Feast of the Sacred Heart of Jesus, we ask God for the openness to be able to enter into our own lives. We ask God for the openness so that we might be greater aware of God's presence within our own life, within the lives around us, and within the world that we all exist on. Thank you so much, and have a great feast day.
Content from the Springhouse is available free of charge. If you find this ministry is of service to you, we hope that you will support us in providing this content in an ongoing manner. We consider this a pay-it-forward endeavor. Not only would your donation help us to cover the expenses of producing its content, you would make it possible for us to offer it to others as well. As long as we are able, by your generosity, we will continue to produce content which we believe will serve the church. We hope that you might become a partner in this ministry. Please click the link in the description below this video to make a donation.